the program. So we ask that you note your questions on the index cards on your table. The Post-it notes are for later in the program, but the index cards are to write your questions on now. We will be collecting and collating those throughout the presentation. So if you want to just throw it up in the air, someone will come and grab that from you, and we'll be ensuring that they're not duplicated, etc. This is important not because we want to dodge questions at all, but because in previewing this information with several of our committees and our staff, we have found that sometimes just 10 minutes worth of information can stretch into an hour or more if we do Q&A while we go. So please write your questions, and we'll take as many as time allows at the end. If you are concerned that your question might not be addressed, please feel free to put your contact information on that card, and we'll make sure to get back to you. We do anticipate presenting this program again and providing future opportunities for discussion, so this is not a once and done thing. Personally also, I wanted to add here that this is a lot to process. The information here today is a lot to process. So if you're just taking it in today, too, that's fine as well. There will be other opportunities to take it in again and respond to it. So if you can't articulate questions right now, that's fine as well. With those logistics out of the way, but one more logistic here.
If you have a seat at a table, there are people in line. People in line? People in line? Can I see your eyes? Raise your hand if you have a seat at your table. So there should be plenty of seats. If you can't find a seat, we'll help you. This is a self-busing experience, but not till after the program. We do not want to have the interruption of anything while we hear this good information. Thank you. Oh, you're praying, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Other logistics? We good? Okay. So with those logistics out of the way, we are here today to learn about Nell, Paul, Sam, Savara, Jack, Suki, Isaac, Frank, Het, and Maria, members of the family enslaved and sold by our church's prominent founders, Jacob Negley and his wife, Barbara Anna Weinbittel Negley. Before we begin in earnest, I'd like to open with a word of prayer. Let's pray. Thank you, God, for the opportunity to be here today, for the many people and public resources that have made this learning possible. As we listen and process and speak today, we ask for humility and clarity and confidence in your deep and generative love. And we ask for wisdom, courage, and faithfulness as we consider how to act, how to repair, and how to follow your Spirit's leading in a way that honors you and honors the people made in your image. Amen. Okay, over to Holland.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, everyone. If we haven't met, my name is Holland Barmer, and I serve on our Facing Systemic Racism Committee and Reparations Ministry team. And I am so glad to, again, welcome all of you. I'd like to extend some specific thank yous and welcomes today. So first, thank you and welcome to the congregation for being here for this important conversation and likely difficult conversation. I also want to recognize some of our visitors. We have in our midst Amber Snyder-Dennis from Bethel AME. We thank you for being here. We have on our Zoom call Jenny from the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us from far away. We have members of the First Unitarian Racial Justice Task Force, and we have at least maybe one or two members of the Alliance for Honor and Repair from the Pittsburgh Presbytery. So if I haven't welcomed you specifically, it's just an oversight, but thank you specifically to those folks. I wanted to extend a special thank you to the archivists from the Heinz History Center, Detry Library and Archives, Sierra, Margaret, and Matt. They've really helped us in this search, and they've even hosted our committee to view the historical documents in person. And I am not going to, let's make sure my mouse works. There we go. So this list shows you how wide-ranging this effort has been. And I'm not going to read all the names here, but we are so grateful to everyone who has helped us find resources, has previewed the content of our presentation, and even those of you who have asked us some really tough questions. So thank you. Our committee gives you its gratitude. I want to take a moment to give you 2 notices up front. So first, we are going to be looking at some historical documents, and those documents contained antiquated and offensive terminology. The committee and I do not endorse the use of that terminology, but if I quote them, it's because we think it's important for you to hear and to see the documents as they were written. And second, a warning that parts of this presentation cover violence, specifically sexual violence and physical violence ending in murder. I will pause at these instances, and we understand if you need to leave the room or do something else to make yourself comfortable at those times. So the first time our present-day church family learned about our connections to enslavement was in 2022. That's when our Facing Systemic Racism Committee hosted Dr. Brock Baylor from the University of Pittsburgh during the church school hour, and he presented on the topic of white supremacy in the church. And as part of that presentation, he revealed that one of our prominent founders and donors had enslaved and sold 2 women. And he showed us this bill of sale, which was very powerful and sobering. So we see here that 22-year-old Nell and 20-year-old Paul are being sold for $250 by Jacob Negley to a man named Robert Spencer. The year is 1808, and the sale takes place shortly after the young women's birthdays. According to Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, Nell and Paul would have been enslaved until their 28th birthdays, so for 6 and 8 more years. So after learning about Nell and Paul, our pastor at the time, Reverend Dr. Patrice Fowler-Searcy, who I hope is enjoying a lovely retirement, Pastor Patrice urged us to find out more about these women and their lives beyond just the birth dates and the first names that we see here. So over the past year, we've spent a lot of time at the Heinz History Center. We've looked through old newspapers, writings about ELPC, and even some probate records to find that information. As you may imagine, it is incredibly difficult to find information about enslaved people via conventional genealogical sources like censuses. So a lot of what you will see here today is property records, and those are records of human beings as property. Nell and Paul are only 2 people across many years of our church's history who we should be learning about, and they may be only the first that we find. Still, for me and the committee, they bring into focus the reality of white supremacy and how we have and continue to benefit from it. So in keeping with what became that commission from Pastor Patrice, we are first and foremost here today to honor the lives of Nell and Paul by telling as much truth as we can about their experience. We're also going to give you a fuller picture of how Nell and Paul and their family and other enslaved people made the founding of our church, other historically white institutions, and Pittsburgh itself possible. And in doing that, we're going to confront some common myths, namely the myth of Pennsylvania as a free state, the myth that enslaved people did only unskilled labor, and the myth that enslavement in the North was kinder and gentler than that in the South. And last, in our group discussion, we will spend some time together sharing our responses and considering how we are called to repair. So I should also say, as part of this, what we will not do today. We are not going to center the Negleys beyond setting context and sharing details that give you perspective on the lives of Nell and Paul and their family. Also, it may be tempting to say to ourselves, well, ELPC wasn't founded until after Jacob Negley and Barbara Anna Weinbittle Negley sold Nell and Poll to Robert Spencer. But we are not here to debate our degree of complicity. We're simply going to say that one of our prominent founders, actually two of our prominent founders, enslaved and sold these people, and that we as a church continue to benefit from their stolen lives and labor. It also may be tempting to remind ourselves of all of the good things that we as a church or that Presbyterians have done. And we are aware there are abundant stories to that effect. But today is not the time for that. I would urge us to sit with discomfort that comes from reckoning with how our church benefits from white supremacy and from enslavement. So I said that we would necessarily mention the Negleys. So why are we talking about them, and what's our connection to them here at ELPC? So surely you've seen the Negley name on street signs in Pittsburgh, but you've probably also seen it in our sanctuary, behind the chancel, and in the chapel, and maybe in this stained glass window in the McKelvey room. So I'm going to let these memorials speak for themselves as to why we're connected to the Negleys. We see here that Jacob Negley and his wife Barbara Anna, or Anna Barbara Weinbittle Negley, quote, donated this ground in 1819 and contributed liberally to the first and subsequent church buildings thereon. They also, quote, were the initial founders of the East Liberty Presbyterian Church and donors of the property April 12, 1819, and, quote, dedicated the site to the worship of Almighty God. Those liberal contributions and donation of the land, which is the land where we are today, tie us to the Negley wealth. And that generational wealth is something that I'd like you to keep in mind as we learn about Nell and Poll and their family. It's illustrated in this very abbreviated family tree. You'll recognize most of the last names here: Weinbittle, Negley, Mellon. Many of us know ELPC as Mellon's fire escape. Who here has heard that phrase? A lot of us. Me too. So that phrase refers to this church building, which is an edifice so beautiful that surely the man who funded its building would get into heaven and escape the fires of hell. But Mellon's wealth did not come to him in a vacuum. This family tree shows us how that generational wealth flows down from the Weinbittles before our founding to the founding of the church and the Negleys and to the Mellons. And stolen lives and labor are one source of that generational wealth. So how could it be that these two women made this generational wealth possible? Are we exaggerating? So Nell and Poll were just two members of an entire family of people enslaved and sold by the Weinbittles and Negleys. We now know that there were 2 adults and 3 other children, and based on their circumstances, their ages, and the ways that they were recorded in documents, they are almost certainly Nell and Poll's parents and siblings. So you see here Nell and Poll's mom and dad, Savara and Sam, and siblings Jack, Suki, and Isaac. We also see Nell and Poll's children, Frank, Het, and Maria, whom we'll talk about later in the presentation. And the family was originally enslaved by Conrad Weinbittle, who was Barbara Anna's father and Jacob Negley's father-in-law. Nell and Poll and their siblings were born on Weinbittle's plantation in what is now Bloomfield in East Liberty. And the family lived together there until Weinbittle's death in 1795. So how did we find that out? One key to finding the family was this county register. So in 1780, Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery required enslavers to register the live births of babies born to enslaved mothers in order to claim those babies as their property. So this transcription of Allegheny County records provides us with information on hundreds of enslaved people in Pittsburgh from the 1780s through the early 1800s. We see here Jack, a male child about 4 years and 10 months old, Nellie, a female child 2 years, 11 months old, Molly, a child 11 months old, Lukey, a female child 4 months old, and Isaac, born in August 1795, all being registered as the property of Conrad Weinbittle or his estate. So you may have noticed some inconsistencies in the names that you've seen. So because Molly's information matches exactly with the information that we have for Paul in other places, we believe that Molly was either a prior name of Paul or a transcription error. We also believe that Luki is a transcription error for Suki. Suki was a much more popular name at the time, even among enslaved people. And it is very easy to mistake a cursive S for an L. And I should mention that briefly, we don't find any other records for Suki after this time, so it's possible that she either died in infancy or something else. It's not out of the question that she might have been sold away from her family, but given where she is in the birth order, as well as laws that prevented the sale of children under 4 away from their mothers, that scenario is a little less likely. So something very important in the family's lives was Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. So who here learned that Pennsylvania was a free state? So while many of us may have learned this, that was not fully the case. Full abolition did not exist in Pennsylvania until the 13th Amendment. And I'll reiterate that. Full abolition did not exist in Pennsylvania until the 13th Amendment, after the Civil War. Many refer to Pennsylvania as a free state because Pennsylvania was the first to pass an abolition law. But, as the name of that law implies, it was gradual. Even enslaved people born before 1780, like Sam and Savara, would be what was called slaves for life. People born to enslaved mothers after March 1st, 1780, like Nell and Poll and their siblings, would be, in legal terms, indentured and sometimes legally considered free, if not practically. So it's much more accurate to call what Pennsylvania had at the time term enslavement, and this is a phrase that historians such as Corey James Young of the University of Iowa use because it really describes the practical reality of the lives of enslaved people in Pennsylvania then. So calling Pennsylvania a free state and calling the enslaved people born after 1780 free or indentured obscures a few key facts. So first, those people were enslaved for 28 years. Second, there were Black Pennsylvanians in their 80s who were still enslaved at the time of the 13th Amendment. There are many newspaper obituaries that tell us about the, quote, last slave in Pennsylvania. And third, a loophole in the law allowed for heritability of enslavement. And until that loophole was closed in 1826, any baby born to any enslaved mother, whether she was term enslaved or a slave for life, that baby could themselves be indentured until the age of 28. And this is a really important distinction from indenture, which could not be inherited and was, in many cases, voluntary. So besides the legal implications of gradual abolition, what was the family's life like? Dad Sam and Mom Savara were born in the mid-1700s. And at that time, even through the time their children were born, Pittsburgh was a frontier. So in 1790, the total population in Allegheny County was only 10,309 people. And to put that in perspective, it's only 1% of our current population, and 6 times that many people fit in Heinz Field or Acrisure. And of those 10,309 people, 9 were free Black people, 150 people were enslaved people. And it's worth noting that at that time, Allegheny County included a lot more land than it does today. It included land in present-day Butler County then, so it was an even bigger area to spread that few people. So and on the frontier, there were some specific ways that people amassed wealth and made a living. The first was by acquiring land. And to claim land, you had to clear that land and maintain it. There were enslaved people doing that labor. We know that the many enslaved people brought here by John Neville to his Woodville plantation in present-day Bridgeville were doing some of that work. Another way of making a living was by doing services for troops at Fort Pitt and other Army installations, so essentially becoming some of the first defense contractors. And this would have included supplying food, providing goods like clothing or leather or spirits, and building roads. So Conrad Weinbittel was one of those first defense contractors, and his work was made possible by the stolen labor of enslaved people. So in this advertisement, liquidating Conrad Weinbittle's tannery upon his death, we get a more specific insight into the family's life. Weinbittle's widow, Elizabeth, and son-in-law, Jacob Negley, are selling a man, a woman, and a child among cattle, tools, and farming equipment. The people in this advertisement are Sam, Savara, and Isaac, Nell and Paul's mother, father, and baby brother. The man is, quote, by trade a tanner and understands farming. And based on the accounts of labor of enslaved people around this time, it is likely that Sam was a skilled tradesman, and he probably even ran Weinbittle's lucrative tannery. And this reality runs contrary to the myth that enslaved people did menial or unskilled jobs. Besides being a skilled trade, tanning was a difficult, dangerous, and time-consuming job that involved noxious chemicals that could burn your skin if you didn't know what you were doing. It was dirty and smelly. The tanneries were often located on the outskirts of inhabited areas because the rotting carcasses smelled so bad. So also parts of the tanning process could take up to 30 hours, and that meant that Sam would have likely spent a lot of time away from his family while tending to the hides. So to step back in time a little bit, we can consider what we know from property records. Sam was born in roughly 1755. Conrad Weinbittle established his tannery roughly in 1771 to supply leather goods to soldiers at Fort Pitt. And by the time of the American Revolution in 1776, Sam would have been 21 years old. So it's conceivable and even likely that Sam might have been toiling in Weinbittle's tannery, making shoes and belts for the patriots who were fighting under that banner of all men are created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and doing all of this while he himself was enslaved. So at the same time that Elizabeth Weinbittle and Jacob Negley were advertising the sale of Nell and Paul, Nell and Paul's other family members, they were executing Conrad Weinbittle's will, and that will specified his wishes for various items of his property, which included Nell, Paul, and Jack. Jack and Nell were to remain the property of his wife, and Paul would be the property of his daughter. That's Negley's wife, Barbara, in Pittsburgh. So what became of the rest of the family, the people in the advertisement? A deed record helps us answer that question. So this deed from Elizabeth Weinbittle and Jacob Negley is for the sale of a man, Sam, a woman, Savara, and a baby boy, Isaac, to David Logan. Logan owned a farm and tannery some 40 miles away in Westmoreland County, and this sale would separate the family. This was at a time when Jack was 10, Nell was 9, Paul was 7, and Isaac was around 3 months old. So seeing one another would have been extremely difficult. There were laws that specified whipping as punishment for enslaved people traveling more than 10 miles without written permission, and also for congregating in groups greater than 4. So even if the family could have gotten that written permission and kept it safe over all those miles, nearly a 100-mile round-trip journey over the frontier, the journey itself would have been so unsurmountable that they probably would not have been able to make it. So considering all these barriers, it is very, very likely that this document, which was signed on November 4th, 1795, marks the last time the family was together. We described a little bit about Sam's day-to-day life as a tanner, but what were Nell and Paul's lives like with the Weinbittles and Negleys? So although it wasn't out of the question that they were doing hard labor alongside men, it was more likely that they were domestic servants, domestic servants, tending to housekeeping, laundry, and food preparation. So the Negley household at the time included Jacob and his wife Barbara Anna. They were in their 30s and 20s, and there were 5 children. So first-person accounts from enslaved people in Virginia, because we don't have any first-person accounts from Nell and Paul themselves, but those first-person accounts tell us that those people were doing labor that included keeping the fires burning, and that was a 24-hour-a-day job, They would also empty chamber pots. They would wash and iron clothing. They would care for babies and children. They would groom adults. They would cook and serve food, and they would otherwise be on call for anything their enslavers might need. And lest we construe this labor as unskilled, consider that the laundry process in the early 1800s was often a 3-day process that in frontier settings like Pittsburgh was at the time, it required homemade chemicals that were often complicated to make and hard to come by. Also, cooking was complicated. Families of enslavers often ate elaborate meals with dishes that numbered in the teens, even for a single lunch or a dinner. So staying on top of these tasks would have required skill and made for grueling days. And even as children of 9 and 7, Nell and Poll would have likely gotten up before sunrise. They would have probably slept on pallets of floors near where they labored, or perhaps above the kitchen. As an example that we know about, the enslaved cook Farrell Tex at Woodville Plantation in Bridgeville slept in a space above the kitchen with her 14 family members. It's also possible that Nell and Poll inherited tasks done by their mother, Savara, after she was sold away to David Logan in Westmoreland County. And they would have done these jobs even as children, all while the Negleys founded Sabbath schools and distributed their considerable wealth across Pittsburgh. Again, supporting the Negley social stature and their wealth going forward and making the early foundations of our church possible. So 1808 was an important year. That was the year that Negley sold Nell and Poll to Robert Spencer, but it was also important in the local and national context as well. So in 1808, you see here in the middle of the slide, Jacob Negley was putting the finishing touches on the Negley Mansion, which was an elegant home. It was located at present-day Stanton and Negley Avenues. And it would become what I consider an early iteration of ELPC. So according to Georgina Negley's history of ELPC, the mansion had a portable pulpit that allowed the Negleys to host church services in their home. In 1808, the importation of enslaved people to the US also was outlawed, and that meant that enslavers began to rely more heavily on the domestic trafficking of enslaved people. It also marks the year that the first manumissions would be taking place under gradual abolition. So those people born in 1780 would have been turning 28 and would have been legally required to be freed. And here on the right, you see a map. Bethel AME, the oldest black church in Pittsburgh, traces their founding to 1808, meeting in a house on Front Street. So that would have just been blocks away from where Nell and Poll would eventually come to live after being sold to Robert Spencer. And as many of you know, Bethel's church building would later be seized, or more accurately stolen, by eminent domain in the infamous urban renewal era of the 50s, which was in large part orchestrated by the Mellons. So returning for a moment to the bill of sale that we saw at the beginning of the talk. The date was April 25th, 1808. It was a Monday. And Nell would have just turned 22, Poll would have just turned 20. Their birthdays were the week before. And Easter would have happened just 8 days prior. So I find myself wondering, given what we knew about the Negleys holding church services in their home, did the Easter holiday have some bearing on the timing of the sale? Did the Negleys wait until after Easter to sell Nell and Poll because they needed them to serve guests in their mansion? Robert Spencer was a tavern owner with connections to many affluent Pittsburghers. Did he visit the Negleys and strike a deal with them? We don't know. But in April 1808, Nell and Poll would have moved to Spencer's downtown tavern and home to work. And at that time, Spencer was 36 years old, he was married, and he had 4 children. Nell and Poll's work would have likely been similar to what they did while enslaved by the Negleys and wine biddles, but it would have been on a larger scale. And that's because besides serving the Spencer family, they would have probably worked in Spencer's tavern. Like many taverns of the time, Spencer's Tavern was also an inn, so it provided both bed and board in addition to food and drink. They would have had a lot more people to care for, a lot more laundry to deal with, and much more cooking and serving to do. And while Nell was still acclimating to life in a downtown tavern and inn, she became a mother. We know this from the same registry of births where Conrad Weinbittel recorded her and her siblings 20-something years before. Spencer here is registering a baby boy, Frank. He was born November 10th, 1808 to Nell, This means that when Jacob Negley sold Nell and Poll, Nell was about 3 months pregnant. Our committee has wondered a lot of things about the birth of Frank. First, could Negley have known that Nell was pregnant? And would that have influenced how much money he sold her for? Second, who was the father of Nell's baby? This record only records names of mothers. But we do see here that Frank is noted as Negro, whereas some records use the term mulatto to indicate a mixed-race child. So could Frank's father have been another enslaved man, or perhaps a free black man? Could he have been someone Nell loved back at the Negley house? And last, what must she have been feeling, newly a mother and in this unfamiliar situation? Those are more questions that we don't have answers for, but documents reveal a little more about Nell and Poll's circumstances. So in the 1810 census, we learn that there were 15 people in the Spencer household. 6 were white people, 3 were enslaved people, and 7 were, quote, other free people. This murkiness is introduced by the Act for the Gradual Abolition and the myth of Pennsylvania as a free state. And it can even make census records difficult to decipher. We don't know whether Nell, Poll, and Frank are the 3 enslaved people or part of the other free people, because even though they were all unfree, the law considered them free or indentured. Some census takers would arrive at the house and see the practical reality of the people living there and note them in the slave column. Other census takers would adhere to the letter of the law and record those people as other free people, reflecting that murky terminology. We also see that in 1812, John Aldridge, a boy of color, whom Spencer called his indented servant, would have also likely resided at the house. And it's possible that Aldridge was also term enslaved rather than voluntarily indentured. So this means that Nell and Poll were not alone at Robert Spencer's tavern. So between 1808 and 1814, Nell and Poll were again making the founding of Pittsburgh institutions possible. Spencer, even though he was not a famous Pittsburgher, was nevertheless really well connected. And here you see a transcript of meeting minutes from the trustees of First Presbyterian Church downtown, where Spencer was a member, and he also gave money in the form of pew rent. And 3 weeks after Nell and Poll's arrival, he was hosting a meeting of the trustees of First in his tavern. Spencer would go on to host more of these meetings, and he would have also hosted others that gathered bank founders and even lawmakers. And Nell and Poll would have almost certainly attended to the needs of these revered Pittsburgh men, some of whom were enslavers themselves. So I'll pause here to warn you that I'm going to be talking about the possibility of sexual violence. And I'll also take a moment to remind you that if you've thought of any questions, write them down on an index card, and Miranda and I believe Ed will also be watching to see if you hold them up. So we'll welcome your questions at the end. So first-person interviews with enslaved people in Maryland who were laboring in the same settings as Nell and Poll tell us that working among patrons of taverns left enslaved people, particularly women, vulnerable to violence, and particularly sexual violence. So in 1812, when Nell and Poll were still enslaved by Robert Spencer, they both gave birth to babies. Nell had a daughter, Het, and Poll had a daughter, Maria. And in contrast to the birth record for Frank, who was described as Negro, the birth records for Het and Maria describe them as mulatto. And although we don't know for sure the circumstances of Het and Maria's conception, there are many accounts of enslaved women bearing the children of their enslavers or other white men without consent. I want to call your attention to some other language too. This record states, quote, born of his Negro woman Nellie and liable to serve until 28 years. That loophole in the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in Pennsylvania allowed for the perpetual heritability of enslavement. And that loophole would not be closed until 1826. And for these people, practically, that meant that Robert Spencer could have legally enslaved Maria, Het, and Frank into their teen years, even after Nell and Poll would have themselves been manumitted. So we have no further records of Nell, but under the law, she would have been required to be manumitted in 1814. It's possible that she finished her 28 years of enslavement with Robert Spencer. But in August of 1813, when Poll had about 3 years of term enslavement left, Spencer sold her to a man named William Wilkins for $125. And if the Wilkins name sounds familiar to you, it is because the landmarks and the streets and the neighborhoods that carry the Wilkins name are named after him or his family. At the time, he was a young, recently married attorney building a political career, and he would then become a city councilman and later a secretary of war under President Tyler. He was also involved in founding banks, and he was a prominent member of First Presbyterian Church, where his father was a trustee. So one thing you may notice is missing from this bill of sale is information about Paul's daughter, Maria. The bill of sale says nothing about her, and at the time, she would have been only 8 months old. So under gradual abolition, children under the age of 4 were not to be separated from their mothers. But we do know that in practice, enslavers didn't always follow the letter of the law. So we wonder if Maria would have stayed at the Spencer home with Nell and her cousins, or maybe whether Spencer included her in the sale and just didn't write it down in the bill. There's also the possibility that she could have died in infancy. Still more questions that we cannot answer. We do know a little bit about the home where Poll likely lived during her enslavement. This oil painting from 1818 shows that home, and this is prior to when Wilkins would move into the better-known area of Homewood Cemetery. So the house where Poll would have lived is the farthest on the left. It's the dark building, and this image appears to show Water Street on the banks of the Monongahela, so that would not have been far from her sister Nell. And ironically, the second building from the left there, the large white one, would go on to become the Monongahela House, which was a tavern active in the Underground Railroad. Abolition efforts in Pittsburgh did not become well organized until the 1830s, so that would have been well after Nell and Poll were to be manumitted. So what else was happening in Paul's life? This is an indenture agreement from 1815, and we get a glimpse of that here. So what you see here is an indenture agreement for a 9-year-old girl named Caroline. Wilkins took her on as a servant when Poll would have had about 6 months of term enslavement left. So knowing that Poll and Caroline overlapped for this short time, I wonder, would Poll have been responsible for training and caring for her? The agreement doesn't say so explicitly, but it's almost certain that she was white. And the reason that we think this is because she has a father here giving his permission to serve for the indenture, and also because her race is not mentioned. We do see the word color or colored or Negro in other indenture agreements of the time. So in this agreement, Caroline signs an X to signify her consent to serve Wilkins until she's 18, and this is all in exchange for a few things: learning to keep house, to sew, to read, and to write. She's also promised a feather bed at the end of her indenture. So when we consider the bills of sale that you've seen alongside this indenture, the contrast is stark. And it's so stark that the archivists at the Heinz History Center often use this document alongside those bills of sale to teach grade school students about the practical realities and the differences between term enslavement and voluntary indenture. And I would ask us, how differently must Nell and Poll and eventually Caroline fared at the end of their term enslavement and their indentures, given the differences in their circumstances? It's possible that Poll finished her term enslavement with William Wilkins. We don't know that for sure, and we don't know where she went after being manumitted. It's possible that she would have indentured herself to Wilkins or Spencer, because that was the choice of many manumitted people in order to remain housed or in a familiar situation. So you may be wondering, what became of Sam, Savara, Jack, and Isaac? So in 1818, David Logan died. You'll remember that he's the Westmoreland County farmer who bought Sam, Savara, and Isaac. As a side note that might be relevant in this context, Logan was also a Presbyterian, and in the minutes of Redstone Presbytery, we find that he was accused of, quote, fathering the bastard child of a woman during his marriage. And once again, a property record, Logan's will, gives us insight into the family's life. There's no mention of Sam here, so he would have been around 60 years old in 1815, and it's possible that he's died. It's also possible that Logan sold him away. We do see Savara, called Sava here, and Isaac. Isaac is now 20 years old, so he would be 8 years away from manumission. Mother Sava and son Isaac are bequeathed to Logan's son William. Logan specifies that they remain, quote, under the direction, control, and command of my son William, and that Sava remain on the farm, saying, quote, I do hereby bind the said place for her support in her old age. And at this point, Savara and Isaac have lived on the Logan farm for 20 years. So it's also worth noting that it was a common practice in the early 1800s for enslavers, even those in southern states, to manumit their enslaved people upon their deaths. And Logan did not do that. He specified here who was to own whom, and these were the people who would keep his farm going for his children, preserving his generational wealth. And we can trace this back to the sale by Jacob Negley and his mother-in-law. The will also tells us there were other enslaved people among Logan's possessions. Quote, a mulatto girl named Betsy, my Negro man named Frank, and my mulatto girl Hannah. So I wonder, what must the family's relationship have been with these enslaved people? Would they have experienced mutual support? Would they have shared camaraderie, burdens, and would they have shared their joys? So one person in the family that we can't account for is Jack. And to remind you, the last time he appears in any records is when he was bequeathed to Elizabeth Weinbittle in 1795. We don't have any census records or property records that name him or otherwise account for him after that time. Elizabeth died in 1803, and her will doesn't mention him. It's possible that he was passed to another family member or sold. But there's another possibility, and I will pause here to warn you that I am going to be talking about violence, and specifically murder. And another reminder, if you have questions, our question collector is back there and she can get them. So in September 1815, Pennsylvania Governor Simon Snyder places this proclamation in the newspaper. It's essentially a wanted ad for Philip Weinbittle, and that was Jacob Negley's brother-in-law. It tells us that the prior winter, Weinbittle had fled justice after killing a man he enslaved by, quote, beating and other cruel treatment. And it was an offense so heinous that the governor offered a $200 reward to bring Weinbittle to justice. And neither this notice nor the official records of the case on file in the State Archive in Harrisburg name the enslaved man. But we've spent a lot of time delving into other sources to try to find out whether the man was indeed Nell and Poll's brother Jack. A book with sketches of prominent Pittsburghers tells the story of an enslaved man named Jack. He had been a faithful servant, quote, of a man named James Horner, another Presbyterian, and had been responsible for taking Horner's farm produce to market. When Horner's neighbor, a wealthy landowner, began to, quote, covet Jack and offered $700 to buy him, Horner declined and emancipated Jack. Shortly after Jack's emancipation, he was found dead and hidden in a clump of trees on an adjoining estate. The story also states that the covetous landowner was accused of the murder and went on the run. And those are details that match almost exactly with the Weinbittle trial information. It seems too strange a coincidence that James Horner testified for Weinbittle's defense. We see this in the official court records from Harrisburg. So could the Jack in the account that I just showed indeed be Nell and Poll's brother? And could the covetous neighbor be Weinbittle? We can't be certain, but it seems very likely. The newspaper article on the right tells us that after a tedious trial, quote, of 15 hours, Philip Weinbittle was acquitted of murder. And that's unsurprising, yet still devastating. The newspaper tells us something else, though, and that is relevant to the lives of Nell and Poll. So Weinbittle's defense attorney was William Wilkins, the very man who enslaved Poll. And that defense would have likely been prepared while Poll was enslaved by Wilkins. So given the close connections among the Negleys, the Winebiddles, Spencer, and Wilkins. Paul and her sister were likely aware of the trial and defense preparations. So what must it have been like to witness your enslaver defending the family member of your prior enslaver in the heinous murder of another enslaved person, potentially your own brother, as you were forced to labor for them? So if I can borrow a phrase from one of my heroes, Henry Louis Gates, this is where the paper trail runs out. We've covered essentially 30 years of family history across 3 generations, and there is still so much more to learn. We have at least one lead for exploring the family's descendants. That is a free black man named Isaac, who's recorded in the 1830, 1840, and 1850 census, living not far from the Logan family farm. And we plan to keep researching, and we will certainly share what we find out. So we hope today that you've learned first and foremost about Sam, Savara, Jack, Nell, Paul, Suki, Isaac, Frank, Het, and Maria, and their experiences. We hope that you'll carry them in your heart and that we as a church can allow their story to teach us. We also hope that you will join us in dispelling some of those foundational myths. We've emphasized today that Pennsylvania was not in fact a free state, that enslaved people worked in technical occupations like domestic labor and tanning that demanded a lot of skill and made enslavers a lot of money. We've also shown that enslavement in the North, which is so often contrasted with the worse enslavement of the South, was not a kind and general experience, and it posed the same dangers as violence. And maybe most relevant to any conversation about reparations, without enslaved people, including the family of Nell and Poll, the establishing of Pittsburgh and our many institutions, even ELPC, would not have been possible. So I would be remiss in not sharing a present-day story with you. So today you saw the bill of sale documenting William Wilkins buying Paul from Robert Spencer for $125. This was unquestionably an exchange of property. Late last year, I found that William Wilkins was listed on the Dickinson College website. That's his alma mater. And he's listed there as a white non-slaveholder. I thought that this might be an oversight. So I contacted Dickinson. I sent them a copy of the bill of sale. I gave them details on where it's housed, and I requested that they correct their website. I received a response from the professor who oversees the project. That's Matthew Pensker. And Professor Pensker declined to correct the website, emphasizing the difference between what he called the, quote, chattel slavery of the South and the status of term enslaved people in Pennsylvania as, quote, statutory servants. So this is the myth of Pennsylvania as a free state in action today. In declining to correct that entry, the professor is denying the truth of Paul's experience and her practical reality. So perhaps this is something to consider in the next part of our conversation. But there are a lot of examples of reparative action that are taking place, and you see a small selection here. So the photograph with the statues is the grounds of the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Those statues are some of Presbyterianism's most revered founders, and the PHS has chosen to tell the truth by posting signs that indicate which of these men were enslavers. The colorful screens are a choreo poem by Black Presbyterian poet and ruling elder Betty J. Dura. And the screens acknowledge our history, or the screens being just a little in front of the statues, only obscure the statues a little, so that allows us to acknowledge our history while we recontextualize those statues with the voices and experiences that were once silenced. On the right, you see the President's House site at the Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, and those are the names of the 9 people enslaved by George Washington who came with him to Philadelphia when he was elected president. I share these as efforts that we might join or join more fully. So we heard a little bit about Bethel AME here today. It is worth getting in touch with Bethel AME to join more fully their reparations effort. There's also the response by Black churches to the defunding of the African American History Museum. There's also Representative Summer Lee's reintroduction of reparations, specifically H.R. 40, and that's an act that has been introduced in the House of Representatives each year since 1989. And of course, the Alliance for Honor and Repair within our own presbytery is studying the experience of Black Presbyterian churches to understand historical harms and to recommend actions. Our committee leader, Lenore Williams, for Facing Systemic Racism, she is a member of the Alliance, so we can talk with her more about that. And you might remember that at ELPC, we established the Jean and Joe Kennedy Fund for African American high schoolers, which was a first step toward reparative action after we removed the Stonewall Jackson window a few years ago. So with the lives and labor of Nell and Poll and their family in mind, what does repair look like? What is it that we as a church are called by God to do? So thank you. That concludes the presentation, and if Miranda and Ed have some questions, we can take those.
All right, I am happy to read some questions as we get them in, and if folks still want to, hold up their cards, I'm happy to come around, and Dr. Edwood as well. The first question we had was, do you have plans to publish this research?
That's a good question. We do. Our committee has been thinking about that. Some of the ideas that have surfaced are proposing an article to the Presbyterian Outlook. I know we have talked briefly and in a preliminary manner with the History Center about publishing an article in their magazine. And I certainly hope that we can post this research and a narrative on our website. And I do believe we're probably going to make these items available in the church, maybe in the meditation room at some point, so that you can come and look at them. Thanks.
Great, I have a few more. First, is there any significance to 28 years old as the term of enslavement?
Not that I know of, but Miranda, I'll throw it back to you. You've done a lot of this research. Do you know?
There's no specific significance to it. As far as we're aware, there were a number of states that would eventually have gradual abolition laws that chose other ages, but most certainly it was to, if I don't mean to phrase this very crassly, but to get the most productivity. If you consider when somebody would be most able to work, it would be in those younger years. And so that was essentially a compromise with people who enslaved other people.
Great, thank you.
Another question was, were there any legal documents related to manumission?
So if the question is about manumission of the family that we discussed today, no, we did not find any manumission documents about them. But I will say that we did go in person to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia, and there are a lot of documents. There are a lot of different documents, including some manumissions, some permissions to travel, some indenture contracts, and unfortunately, most of those, and it's a voluminous collection, most of those are for Philadelphians.
I believe there are also some of those manumissions for Allegheny County that were discovered.
Yes.
And unfortunately, none of those pertain to the folks that Holland was researching.
Yeah, and if you are interested in seeing manumission documents, I believe the Free at Last ? Exhibition at the History Center has some of those, and you might even be able to see them online.
Great. Another question. How much was Henry Louis Gates used to help in research?
Oh, so much. I think if any of you are familiar with his TV show, Finding Your Roots, I feel like the manner in which he interrogates people's pasts is really beautiful and really amazing, of course, because why wouldn't it be? He's amazing. So I tried to take a little bit of that. We tried to take a little bit of that as we prepared this presentation.
There was no direct involvement from Henry.
Oh, no,
Louis Gates.
sorry. Yeah, no. Just,
Great.
yes.
His spirit, yes.
I feel like I know where that question came from.
So I believe the person who asked the question originally about publishing the research says, I was thinking more about publishing a book, selling, and then using the money to fund the committee's activities.
That's certainly an excellent idea, and I'll give a shout out to Dr. Linda Lane. She has brought this up a couple of times, so maybe with our committee's help and God's help, we could do something like that.
I'm going to read one more comment, and then I'm going to read a final question, because I think we're probably reaching that point. And if we don't get to your question, if you had one, you can write your contact information on that, and we can get to it. The comment is, thank you, Holland and team, for welcoming visitors from outside your church walls, for your extraordinary research, your forthright honesty, and for allowing us to bear witness to this repair of truth. I know this isn't a question, but just had to express.
Thank you very much.
And then finally, because I think this is probably an excellent transition to Beverly and Alex, can we write letters and put pressure on the professor who refused to correct his record of slaveholding?
Yes, please. That would be wonderful. All right, thank you. I'll welcome Beverly up. She's going to lead our discussion. She has a few questions for us. Thank you.
But before we get to the discussion, I'd like you to join me in giving a rousing applause to Helen. She has really done what I think is God's work. It has been a dedication of insurmountable attention. So my name is Beverly Harris Shentz, and I'm supposed to lead you in discussion questions, and I'm going to ask, we passed this out. I'm not sure everyone has it. If you don't at your table, please share it with the people on the sides who may not have it. We're going to do some discussion with you just for a few minutes to give you a chance to give vent to what you're thinking. But we're going to have 4 recorders. There are 4 questions, and with my recorders come up, this Rebecca, who's on the small committee with me to talk about questions, and Alex, come on Alex, and Jess, and Michelle is going to come back. And each of them is going to take a question. So Alex, you got number 1, Michelle, you got question number 2, Rebecca 3, and Jessica 4. Before we get to the questions, I just would like to share with you, because we've heard some difficult information, and we can't really begin to process it, but we'd like to at least get started in thinking about it. So I'd like you to think along with me. Alex, we had a little mini committee, and Alex came up with some discussion principles that I think will put us in good stead. One is, there is no simple correct response to any of these questions. We all come from different places, we all have had different experiences, and those experiences have shaped us. So it is clear that we will think differently, and that is as it should be. We want you to honor your feelings. Whatever feelings you are having heard that presentation, are your feelings. They're not Beverly's, because you're not Beverly. So we want you to honor those feelings. We also want you to respect the experiences and feelings of others for the same reason. We all come to this table with a different set of backgrounds. We want you to focus on being present with us, not being perfect, and also allow some discomfort in this. My experience in life is that I only have really learned when I've been a little bit uncomfortable. There are some of those today who would like us all to be comfortable. Sorry, not happening. So that's the prelude. The first question that we have is, what did you hear that resonated with you, surprised you, or challenged you in this presentation you heard from Holland? You can raise your hand and you can tell me, and I'll tell you again in the mic. If you feel more comfortable writing that down on a Post-it, you can do that and somebody will bring it up to us. But that's the first question. What did you hear that resonated with you, surprised, or challenged you? Ray? The property on the hill that you're talking about is probably AME, right? The AME Bethel. And I'm not able to answer that question, but we have someone here from Bethel who could speak to that. And we want to sort of notice that there is a relationship between what we're talking about.
Right. Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Amber Dennis. I am Reverend Dr. Dale Snyder's daughter, and I am a member of Bethel AME. And the property on the lower hill, we do still have rights to it, but we're still understanding what to develop on that property. So we are still in the works of developing the property.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
No? Okay.
He's asking if reparations have been made at that property, and that's not something we can respond to, Ray, but we would ask you to contact perhaps AME.
Right, so we're still working with the URA and the city and other areas. And so if you want to reach out, I can give you my email. We do have meetings on Thursdays about Bethel and the updates that we have and the property as well. I can take your information or provide you with mine.
That's great. Okay, thank you so much. So one of the things we can say is that this presentation made you think of another situation where reparations would be necessary. Somebody else. What surprised you? What resonated with you? What challenged you? Yes. The tannery story challenged Hank.
The fact that we take for granted leather, but leather is the skin of an animal, and the fact that it takes incredible volume of work to do it.
Right.
And so I appreciated hearing more of that in detail.
Right. And that also dealt with the idea that we often are told that enslaved people were not doing skilled labor, and that challenges certainly that myth, as Holland pointed out. Something else resonated you through challenge. Yes, ma'am.
We've all been fed myths about how wonderful we are as Americans. I was so surprised to learn about the history of slavery in Pennsylvania. It's something that I never knew. It's like, oh, we did the Underground Railroad, we did this and that, and
very good point.
wow.
The idea that slavery here was very alive and well is something that I think many of us were not aware of. I certainly know that when I grew up, Pennsylvania was a free state. And now I begin to question how free was that free state. This is one that we have here. One second, ma'am. Challenge to find out more about my family history and the probability that they were slaveholders. Certainly that might well be true. The challenge to find out more about my personal history. I know of a person, I now know of Pennsylvania as up south. Today there are 3 Aryan nations and more hate groups than in other states. So in other words, this changed your perception of the state in which we live, or added to the change of that perception. Okay.
Thank you. I was surprised to learn that there is so much documentation about this history that we have chosen to ignore for all these years in order to create myths that keep us happy.
Thank you very much. Chosen to ignore history is a very good point. You know, it sort of ties into the fact that if you don't know, you can't do, right? So when people tell us not to read books, I wonder why that is. Perhaps the information would be valuable. Right? Yes, ma'am.
Where is Nell and Paul's resting place?
I don't know that where did Holland go, my person? The question was, where is Nell and Paul's final resting place?
We have also wondered that, and we don't know. We don't know anything about them beyond that last bill of sale that you saw from 1813 when Paul would have been 25. So we don't know, but we're trying to find out.
Yes,
And you can consider the fact, too, that women were not named in censuses until after 1850, so it's very hard to track those folks, unfortunately, beyond that point.
okay. Yes, ma'am.
The loophole in the gradual Abolition Act is really diabolical, and I feel like I'm going to think about that for a while, because how can you truly leave if you're leaving your children behind? Like, that's a really evil way to keep the people that you're supposedly manumitting.
At the same time that you are manumitting, you're only manumitting some and not others. Absolutely, not the children of those you're manumitting. Yes, thank you.
Hello, I think that this training was excellent, so you did an excellent job, Holly. And I want to just congratulate the committee as a whole. And I just want to make a comment when people talk about Pennsylvania. There's a lot of things I learned today too, but I remember when I was in graduate school, and that was a long time ago, but I remember talking to a woman from Virginia, African American, who had a background in history. And she said to me one day, you know, Pennsylvania is a racist state. And I was like, worse than Virginia? You know? And she said yes, and she was very honest with me. And she said, but it's something that we kind of keep secret. And I thought, okay. Well, I was doing a training years later, and it was in the 90s, so it was a long time ago. And the University of Pittsburgh actually did some research that said Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and surrounding counties were one of the most racist areas in the country, next to Macon County, Georgia. And I didn't realize that, but then my mind started to wander a little bit when I was in Duquesne working on my master's degree back in the day in psychology. And there was a graduate student in the PhD program. He came up to me and said, you're working on your master's? And I said, yeah. He said, well, you know that Duquesne, my university, one of them, is called the Plantation Away from the South. Wow. And this was a white male out of California. So I just want to say these things, that there's a lot of negativity, but I'm so glad that we're looking at some of these issues because they do affect us, and we have to know more about our history.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it is what we don't know can keep us in ignorance and keep us from moving forward. I have a statement here that this makes me aware, this is one of the statements I received, makes me have a heightened awareness when I see street names, buildings, organizations with names that we see now, Negley, Weinbittle. That was my first reaction as well, that all of a sudden names take on new significance to me. And I'm not a Pittsburgher, so I had to learn those names. Okay, one more?
Yeah, what resonated with me were just Holland's kind of depictions of what, the people who were enslaved may have been experiencing in the homes. Like, oh, they probably overheard when their brother, they were planning the whole, the case against their brother, just imagining these things, those unanswered questions we will never know. That really resonated with me. Yeah.
Right, thank you very much, Sarah. Right, Holland did a very good job of putting our heads behind what could have been asked. What were the questions that are outside of the information we have that we can ask? Thank you so much. Yes.
Actually become free?
That's a good question. Where did Holland go? They became, well, Holland, you go for that one. Depends on the definition of freedom, probably.
So we don't know for certain, we don't have any documents that indicate whether the family actually was, or the family members were actually manumitted. The one clue that we do have is that free black man, Isaac, and we don't know for sure that he's the Isaac from the family that we're researching, but if that is indeed the Isaac from the family we're researching, then he did eventually get free. So we don't know about the other family members.
Okay. Yes, this is the last one on this. We're going to move to the next question. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Certainly what I was surprised about is the degree of slavery here in Pittsburgh. But when I visited Philly, and I'm not from there at all, but it seems like, of course, our Washington and Jefferson and all those people, what have they done, I wonder, in Philly to address some of these issues that it seems like I'm just learning about in Pittsburgh?
By that, you mean the city of Philadelphia?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not something that we dug into.
Yeah. That's not a question we can answer for you. Yeah, oh yeah, sure, Tom.
I can respond to that, if you want me to. Okay, so question for Philadelphia. Actually, a couple of things, and there's a specific organization called Monument Lab that is fundamentally looking at the creation of monuments, and this is being run by Paul Farber. They got a major, I want to say, was it a Crest grant, like $1 million grant, to actually assess the creation of monuments, but then also to look at what happened when George Washington was in Philadelphia, what happened when Thomas Jefferson was in Philadelphia. And so, for example, the house where Thomas Jefferson, in theory, wrote the Declaration of Independence, they actually had an art installation, noted artist looking at literally the eyes of potential descendants of enslaved persons and actually having them in the windows for this house. Oh yeah, it was powerful.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, yes, and this is the last one for this question. We need to get on another one.
I wondered if we could look into historical societies or contact historical societies in the Pittsburgh area. I know the Lawrenceville Historical Society, one of the members is a very proficient author who's written a lot of different books on Lawrenceville, and if you would concentrate or contact those societies, you might get a lot of information or at least a glimmer and then go from there.
Thank you. So contact local historical societies would be your suggestion. Okay, Holland, you got another job description. Okay, moving on to the next question. Do any of you have unanswered questions that exist for you right now? We don't know, for example, about the final resting place of Nell and Poll. We don't know whether they were actually manumitted. Other questions that you'd have that have brought this to mind? Yes.
How can you make this place peaceful if it was built off of hate?
Good question. How can you make this place peaceful if it was built off of hate? That's a question we'll ask. I certainly don't have the answer. She's talking about this building, I believe. The building. If the building was built, she said, on a basis of hate, can it be made peaceful? Is the question she's asking. Okay. Another question, unanswered question.
Can you explain the loophole? I'm not sure I fully understood the loophole.
Okay. I think I do, but I'd rather have
Miranda, let me take that one. There was basically the Gradual Abolition Act said that anybody born to an enslaved mother after 1780 would themselves be term enslaved for 28 years and then would be due to be manumitted. Technically, that law defined those term enslaved people as free or indentured. So one would assume that if those people had children, their children should not be enslaved, but should be, or indentured, but should be born free. However, the interpretation of that law by slaveholders in Pennsylvania was those people who were born after 1780, those women that were term enslaved, their children were then term enslaved. And so that was essentially a loophole in the law that would have allowed term enslavement to go in perpetuity forever. And in 1826, a court case was decided that said that was not the original intention of the law, or should not have been the intention of the law, however you want to put it, and they put a stop to that, so that then folks born to term enslaved people were technically born free. Of course, they were also with their mothers in their term enslavement.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Miranda.
I'm sure Nell and Paul weren't the only slaves in Pittsburgh. It'd be interesting to know how many other enslaved people were here in Pittsburgh during that time.
So the question, how many other enslaved people were in Pittsburgh at the same time? Thank you. There was a, yes, sir.
When did this congregation have its first African-American
question? Anybody answer?
Yeah, I might, I'll defer
Oh,
that
the question was, let me just re-answer the question. The question was, when did this congregation have its first African-American member?
So I'm hearing from in the room, from some of our institutional knowledge, the late 50s. That is a question that we also had while doing this presentation.
And may I ask how you know it was 1958?
My father was the minister here at that time, and he made it possible for the first Black family to join.
Thank you.
Which was traumatic for a lot of the members here.
Can you imagine? Thank you.
What were the names? What was the family name?
Gus Johnson.
some-
Do you know?
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Looking, other questions, unanswered questions? We got that one. I got an answer, actually. That was good. Any other questions you have following this? Yes, Miranda.
Have there been other Black churches in Pittsburgh that have been looking at this issue that we could join in with?
Have there been other Black churches looking at the issue? One of the Black churches that we've talked about is Bethel AME, but that doesn't specifically relate to the issue of enslavement, but rather to reparations for contemporary behavior, as I understand it. Correct? Has
Still is about liberation for Black people, and so it is definitely one of the churches that you could work with. We have the longest history, as you know, and so I think this may better answer your question, sir. We are still working to put out a request for proposals currently for people to develop or developers to come in and look at the property. We're asking that an individual from the company Trek or the developer Trek chooses our site. He's choosing between the Lower Hill site as well as another site in the Hill District where they would have to tear down a police station and to build that property. But the history of Bethel goes way back to slavery. We are looking to discover our history as well and uncover more of our stories. And we also want to work with universities. So we're working with Duquesne, we're working with Pitt. We are in conversations with Carnegie Mellon as well to get students to help us do this research and uncover the history. There are other AME churches in the area as well, outside of the Hill District and within the Pittsburgh area. And so I don't know if I answered your question and if that helped with the other person's question.
So a primary partner would be AME Bethel because of the age of your church, certainly, and its history.
How can we use the wealth of our church and this building to honor the legacy and contribution of Nell and Poll in the building of this church?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Gregory?
With some of the stories of Nell and Paul that we've heard about, as well as all the other collective things here that took place in the North, and other incidences would lead up to what would eventually become the war between the states starting in 1861, the war between the North and the South. Would they be contributing factors to that?
Thank you. Moving along then, what ideas do you have, and this ties into what Pastor BJ said, about how ELPC should respond to this history that we've learned about? What ideas would you have as to how we as a congregation should respond?
I was thinking, I'm so sorry. The prior conversation about Nell and Paul and statues and the meaning of statues, And your question as to what we can do to honor Nell and Paul for being slaves within our own congregation, being sold, and their family generation and stuff, is to give true honor to them by everyone else has plaques and stuff. My thing is to give honor, give knowledge. If people are aware of things, and sometimes so many people are ban the books, ban this, ban that, it's because they don't really want history to come out. And I, as a child growing up, I always said history is based off of the person who's writing the book and what they want people to know. So if we, and like what they mentioned about maybe ELPC putting together a book and having the prophet comes back, because it's giving the entire nation true knowledge of what is going on and the truth, instead of just one-sided version. It's a combination of an open side for everyone to see what exactly went on, what went on, and the fact that there wasn't really free slaves, and that Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh still had slaves, is something we need to let people know.
So if I were to summarize, are you suggesting that we find a way to honor the history of Nell and Paul in order to educate those who are not aware of that history, but also to take responsibility for knowing that history, I think, as well, and to pass it on? Thank you.
Well, that was pretty much what I was going to say, is we should probably have a memorial somewhere in this space to honor that legacy, but perhaps that is something that we include on tours going forward, is embracing what our heritage was and not hiding it, so we can move forward.
Right. Recognition of that history rather than hiding that history, and also the possibility of a visible memorial to that history and the people involved. Thank you. Somebody else, Ray?
Yeah, if we could find out who Nell and Paul's family are now, and just give them a certain amount of money,
Your point, Ray, would be to identify the descendants of Nell and Paul. I think that's a difficult charge, because at this point, I mean, not to say we shouldn't undertake it, but I think it is a difficult charge to try to find out if we can identify the descendants of Nell and Paul. But I pass that to Holland. Happy to pass that on, Holland.
And there are a few leads to that, but yeah, we'll try.
Okay. But to identify the descendants of Nell and Paul and decide if we want in some way to recognize that. Okay. Saw somebody else. Yes, ma'am.
Just this afternoon about the question of who the first African-American members of this church were. And that was not that long ago, and there was one person in the room who knew the answer to the question. So somehow the people, the congregation needs to be engaged. Maybe it's through a fundraising campaign to put more money in the scholarship fund, or certainly in terms of educating people who come and go through this space as members and visitors.
I think that the notion of educating the congregation and educating those who come into our building about our history would be certainly a place to begin. Yes.
I know I've already talked a lot today, but I want to go off of a couple of other things that people have said. And Ray, what you said, take a moment to say that as the reparations ministry team and facing systemic racism, we conceive of reparations, and this is not our own framework, but we conceive of it as the restoration of truth, wealth, and power. So three different parts of sort of themes that we can do in confronting this history.
One other piece that was brought to my attention, and that is, spiritually speaking, we can do services of lament to lament what has happened and what we have learned about the past, and to pray for wisdom about the future, I would say as well.
One of the questions I had kind of leads into maybe an action item is, if we're just learning this in the past few years, what other congregations in Pittsburgh, but broader perhaps, have a similar story or have things about their past that they might not know? So I wonder if part of our path ahead is truth-telling to our friends and saying, hey, we found this out this way. Maybe you could look into your history. Maybe this is something that you all would like to know about your congregation or your community, and lend some of our knowledge of how we took these steps, because there was a lot of labor to get to where we are right now. That would help someone else move along quicker, maybe, to find out some of their truth.
And I think that what speaks to that is the suggestion that the presentation that you and we have all heard be made available through the Presbyterian Outlook or another Presbyterian publication. It would be a way, we'd be having a large audience of believers who may very well have similar truths that are hidden. Yes.
I always like to say that we live in the heartbed of Presbyterianism here in Western Pennsylvania. And I think I'd like to know a little bit more about Bethel AME and how much support you folks had or didn't have from other Presbyterian churches when your land was taken. I think I'd like to know a little bit more about Pittsburgh Presbytery and what our churches as a whole were doing at the time.
One second.
I'd kind of like to make a pitch for what we can do. There are two very important people who did this work today and about 11 other people on the committee. We need you. I'm very serious. We need you.
Yes.
Not just to offer ideas, but to lend a hand. And one of the first things that we have on our agenda, aside from expanding this program and more information, is to respond to the requirement of the Presbytery to develop an anti-racism what's the word? Lenore's not here, so of course I can't remember, statement. So that's a very comprehensive thing. That's not just sitting down and saying, we're against racism. So we need you in this work ahead.
We have in our audience today Peter Gilmore, who is a historian of the Scotch Presbyterian area, and I don't know whether, Peter, you might want to say something?
Does Peter want to say something? You look reluctant.
Well, I guess I'm wearing two hats. First of all, I should acknowledge that I am a member of Pittsburgh Presbytery's Alliance for Honor and Repair. So to kind of maybe answer, at least indirectly, some of the questions that have been raised, Pittsburgh Presbytery and its constituent congregations did absolutely nothing in the 1950s with regards to Bethel AME, which is why my congregation, 6th Presbyterian, presented an overture to Pittsburgh Presbytery encouraging Presbytery to sign on to Bethel's campaign for reparations. That was accepted unanimously, and at the same Presbytery meeting, the Alliance for Honor and Repair was created. And what we have been doing as the Alliance is extensively meeting with members of the historically African-American congregations in Pittsburgh Presbytery. We've interviewed African-American clergy. We have met with African-American members of congregations that are not historically Black congregations, and a team of members and volunteers, which included Holland, have read through every page of every minute of Pittsburgh Presbytery, and we're analyzing those results and hope to put together a set of recommendations with regards to reparations that we will bring back to Presbytery. Presbytery already has, by the way, an anti-racism transformation team, which works in conjunction also with the Matthew 25 committee. I'm not sure if more resolutions and committees are necessarily the answer, but I am hopeful that the work of the Alliance will be something concrete that we can bring back to Presbytery, which then can be communicated to all the constituent congregations, and we can have a program of reparations. Let me put on my other hat as historian, as Dave mentioned. Not to, and I hope I'm not whitewashing the Presbyterian congregations that existed in Western Pennsylvania 200 years ago, but it should be said that this congregation and First Presbyterian are somewhat unique in that they have always been citadels of power and privilege. That's why there's the relationship between the Nagleys and the Wilkins. The Wilkins, a bedrock of a firm foundation of the Democratic Party machine in Western Pennsylvania, which was allied to the politicians and the slave owners of the South. That's part of the story. I think partially, probably more so for economic reasons than for theological reasons, although those were there too. You will not find the degree of slave owning as you might have found in Pittsburgh in the small country churches. Those were farming families that didn't have the means to own people even if they wanted to, and maybe they did. That said, the Presbyterian family includes not only our denomination, but 225 years ago, several other denominations, the Reformed Presbyterians, the Associate Reformed, and the Associate Presbyterians, all of which took a stronger stand and decided stand against slavery than the mainstream denomination, to tell you the truth. And so you'll find Covenanters and Seceders in Indiana County and Westmoreland County and beyond actively involved in the Underground Railroad.
So if I could just cut to the chase, are you suggesting then that the financial wherewithal had something to do with the support of slavery in Pittsburgh, in the citadel that you're describing? The financial wherewithal that was represented by the Weinbittles, by the Mellons, by the Negleys was supportive of slavery, whereas that support was not as prevalent in rural areas. Yes. Okay, thanks. Just wanted to make sure I got it. Okay.
It's amazing what a difference a decade can make. I and the archive committee were in charge of revamping the display cases in the session room. So if you've ever been in there, there are lovely pictures of the Nagleys and the different church buildings. I think it's time to create a display case of Nell and Paul. And I hope that you're willing to do that. And maybe that would be an appropriate room to put a plaque in.
Thank you. So the idea of renewing that history to be more reflective of what we now know that history to be. Yes. Okay.
I appreciated your breakdown of the focus of truth, wealth, and power. And I'm grateful for the truth telling today. And I think that there's a great amount of work to do around wealth and power still. And I just want to name what might it look like to redistribute the wealth of our endowment to empower African American organizations in our city. So I think just this term of redistribution of wealth and power are quite significant. The building that we sit in, the 3 blocks, and Peter, your point of the wealth that's always been here. That redistribution, I think, will be very challenging, and I hope we'll have the courage to lean into it.
Thank you. One last question, and that is, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Sir, I didn't see you. Excuse me.
Is it known whether the Neckley's son James was a member of this congregation? Because he was a prominent Union Army general who made a not insignificant contribution to ending slavery. In fact, as a Republican congressman, he might have voted to pass the 15th Amendment in 1869.
The question is whether or not the son James Negley was involved at all in anti-slavery behavior. I think is the question, sir. So he was a union officer.
Yeah, I would say that that's out of scope for our research because we were looking into the family, so we don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Just one last thing, if there's anyone else who has a suggestion for future programs or actions for our FSR team, Facing Systemic Racism team, especially reconstituting it to include all of you as members. That's one of our tasks, one of our goals. But once we've done that, what would you like us to direct our attention to? Suggestions for programs, suggestions for actions. Don't all speak at once. Yes.
Can you have follow-up on some of these? May
Good.
at a later date?
Yes, follow-up. Thank you very much. We would like very much to do that. And since it came from the audience, I can ask the question. How many of you would be interested in having us to plan a retreat or a workshop to go into more detail about this? Hands, please. Hands, people who would be interested. Okay. Now, we're taking photos of all of you, right? You know that. So we now have your name and your face. Okay, so that is what we'd like to do, is to have some follow-up activities, but we want to make sure that if we invest the energy in the planning, that you will invest the energy in the coming and participating. I'm speaking now as Beverly. I don't like to work if I don't get any results. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, excuse me, somebody right here.
Yes, for future projects, we have several. One at Trinity AME, which is around the corner from Bethel. We're looking to turn that into a food pantry, so in the coming months, when the changes that the administration has implemented, we can turn that into a food pantry so community members can come and collect food items as needed when needed. And so for that to happen, we need our electrical panel replaced. It's the original that was in the building, so for us to pass that, so that's another project for Trinity, to create that into a food pantry. Another item is for a child care or daycare after school care program at Bethel for kids to come after school. And so for that, we are seeking a director of that program. So if you know any retired teachers or retired principals to come and help us with that program.
Thank you so much.
Listening to you talk about the amount of power in the history of this church, there's a lot of power today, mostly elected officials, who may have no idea of this history and what you're doing. So I would encourage you to invite elected officials in the city and county to come to your events and learn about this, because for the most part, our white elected officials are afraid to talk about racism, and they need to know that there's an important institution in our in our city that is taking this on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there somebody?
Oh, can I grab this one since I'm here? Thanks.
Has there been a definition of this group as to what reparations would look like or what it involves? I mean,
I won't get very in-depth, but the three framework, the restoration of truth, wealth, and power, and there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of possibility there. So it's a big question. So that's our very abbreviated framework.
Okay, I have one simple item that might be an easy action item, is looking at our membership. When I first joined the church, I think that was maybe 1990, it was a long time ago, and the church was definitely focused on inclusion and diversity, which it is now, and I am staying here for that reason. But I have seen the African American membership decline. I might be wrong though. So somebody else that has the history and the numbers, but I think that would be good too, to really focus on increasing the membership of Black and brown people. And I can see that that's starting, but I just remember years ago it seemed like it was more, and I might be wrong. So I don't know if anybody has that history, but I think if that's what I just think it's important that we need to look at that again.
Thank you very much. And I think all of us would want to agree that our church should look like the society that we live in. And this is a society at the moment that is really having difficulty dealing with anything diverse. And so if we claim to be inclusive, then we need to be inclusive. And on that note, I think I've dealt with all of your questions. You're hiding them, and you're probably tired. So Pastor Michael, if you would come and give us your final blessing, and thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to all of you for listening, for your attention span. 38 years of classroom, I'm impressed with you. I really am. Thank you so much.
She's impressed with everyone here, and we are impressed with the work of the committee and the volunteers. Another round of applause and appreciation for all the work that they've done. Truth-telling is not easy business. It's hard to celebrate and even preach good news when it is wrapped in news that is not so good. And for us, we have to reckon with that, and I'm grateful that this is just a start for this conversation, and there might be real fears that we have here. People start talking about the endowments. Oh, Lord Jesus, help me. And regardless of how you're feeling, I think that is right and true, as was stated at the beginning of our meeting. These are right feelings, these are good feelings, and they're true and authentic to you. And so I invite you to sit with that now as we pray. Spirit of life, spirit of freedom, and spirit of liberation. We are thankful when we have opportunities to come face to face with not only our past and our history, but the history and past of all of humanity. God, help us. Help us to reckon with the past, but also to reckon with the present as it impacts the future. Help us to see that there are real people behind all of these injustices, and the injustice carries on to today. Help us, God, to not ignore them, but to come face to face with them and to ask questions and not rush to hurry up some sort of solution, but rather be authentic in our need to ask for forgiveness and to seek repair. I ask you to bless this congregation and all the volunteers, the members, the congregants, those in the Presbyterian, and especially all those in our historically Black communities and churches here in Pittsburgh. Help us, God, to listen to their voices as we seek your Spirit's lead. May we follow her always. Amen.